His wife disappeared after landing. Who took her luggage? Mason Hartley stood in the airport waiting area, watching the stream of passengers descending the escalators and heading toward the exits. Many of them moved quickly, their faces showing a mixture of exhaustion and relief as they finally reached home after a long journey. Mason glanced at his watch. Flight 3473 should have landed a few minutes ago. His heart beat a little faster because this wasn't just another flight. It was the one bringing back his wife, Savannah. He loved these moments when he could meet her after a trip. Savannah was smart and determined, often traveling for work. But each time she returned, Mason felt a certain lightness, as if she brought an invisible joy into their lives. Lost in his thoughts, he waited for her to appear. But as time passed, his musings grew more chaotic. It was an ordinary day. He knew she was supposed to land on time. There was no reason for concern. Yes, the airport seemed a bit more chaotic than usual, but nothing alarming. Finally, the screen displayed, "Flight 3473 has arrived." Mason smiled slightly, watching as people left the terminal one by one. They moved briskly, their steps deliberate and eager. He positioned himself at the spot where she would appear and waited. The sound of rolling suitcase wheels on the floor was oddly soothing, but the minutes dragged on, and Savannah was nowhere to be seen. He scanned the crowd, scrutinizing every woman who passed by. Her absence felt not just strange, it was something more. Other passengers hurried toward the exits, collecting their bags, but she was missing. Trying to suppress his frustration, Mason checked his watch. It had been more than 15 minutes since her plane was supposed to land. He looked around the hall again. This was no longer a routine, comfortable wait. Now, an unexplainable sense of unease crept over him. After contacting airport staff, he learned that the flight had landed without issues, and all passengers had disembarked. Something felt off. Savannah should have been among them. Determined to figure out what was going on, Mason walked toward the baggage claim area. Perhaps she'd been delayed or was dealing with her luggage. Approaching the carousel, he saw a suitcase that he instantly recognized. It was her suitcase. He stepped forward, retrieved the bag, and inspected it. A mix of confusion, disbelief, and something indescribable stirred in his heart. Examining every detail of the suitcase, he tried to understand what was happening. If Savannah wasn't on the flight, why was her luggage here? The suitcase was heavy, with a few small scratches he hadn't noticed when helping her pack before her trip. Mason pulled it along, his mind racing with questions about where his wife could be. What was going on? Back in the waiting area, he quickly dialed her number. The call didn't go through at first. He tried again, and after a few seconds, he heard her voice. "Mason," she said. Her voice was soft but carried a strange undertone, as if an unexpected distance had taken hold of her. "Savannah, where are you? I'm at the airport, but you're not here, and your suitcase is. What's going on?" "Oh, it's hard to explain. I was supposed to return on that flight, but I had to leave urgently for work. I'm sorry, I meant to tell you, but there was so much going on." She paused, and Mason noticed a change in her tone. It was less certain, almost hesitant, like something was amiss. "You left?" he asked, trying to keep the confusion out of his voice. "Yes, that's right. Mason, I need to go now. I'll explain everything when I can." "Don't worry, okay," she said, and before he could respond, the call ended. Mason stood frozen in the waiting area, still holding her suitcase. Questions swirled in his mind, growing more tangled by the second. Something was wrong. She never cut conversations short like that, and her voice. It wasn't quite right. If he hadn't been so preoccupied, he might have noticed it earlier. He stood there, feeling his frustration give way to a wave of unexplainable worry. What had really happened to Savannah? And why was her luggage left behind? Mason took the suitcase and slowly walked toward the exit. The questions in his mind had no simple answers. At home, Mason sat in his chair, clutching the suitcase he'd just retrieved from the airport. With a serious expression, he carefully unzipped it. Savannah was always meticulous with her packing, but something was different this time. Everything seemed hurried and out of place. The usual order and precision that characterized her bags were missing. Instead of her elegant dresses and familiar belongings, the suitcase contained unfamiliar items. It was securely closed, but the scent still seeped through the cap. It wasn't the kind of scent Savannah would wear. It was strong, even slightly aggressive. Mason held his breath before reaching into the suitcase for the next item. It was an expensive, luxurious bracelet with gemstones. It was wrapped in silk fabric, like a gift. Mason held it in his hands, examining the details. The feeling inside him was unclear but unpleasant. What was this? Why was her suitcase so unusual? But the most intriguing and crucial item was a ticket for another flight. Pulling it out from under everything else, Mason saw that the name on the ticket was different. Clark Rayleigh. He examined the name, repeating it in his mind. He knew this name. Clark Rayleigh was a prominent attorney, well known in the business world, and also someone Savannah had occasionally mentioned in relation to work. What was going on? Mason decided to look into it, but troubling thoughts were already forming in his mind. Mason slowly placed the ticket on the table and looked through the suitcase again. Something was clearly off. He felt his heartbeat quicken, but at the same time, a sense of anxiety began to grow. He remembered calling Savannah. Her voice lacked the usual warmth he was accustomed to, and it unsettled him. Now he held only fragments of a puzzle that didn't fit together. Mason couldn't bear it any longer. He picked up his phone and started calling their friends. Mutual friends they had known for years, people they met at various events and dinners. It seemed like these were the ones who might know something about her plans or this strange departure. But what he heard only deepened his suspicions. "Hi, Danny, it's Mason. Have you heard anything about Savannah's trip? She didn't tell me anything, and now I can't reach her," he asked over the phone. "Oh, Mason, I don't know. I heard she went somewhere, but nothing special, just the usual, work. Didn't she tell you she was going?" "No, I didn't even know she was planning to leave," Mason replied, his voice tense. "What about the others? Did anyone know about this trip?" "No, nothing like that," Danny responded, his voice sounding a little nervous, then added, "Maybe she's just tired, man. You know how she is. Sometimes she shuts down when there's a lot of work." Mason paused for a few seconds before responding. He already understood that this answer didn't align with the truth, but he simply said, "Okay, got it. I'll call later." He checked his phone again, but Savannah hadn't called. He decided to reach out to a few more people, her colleagues, friends she often communicated with. None of them knew anything about her plans. It seemed she hadn't told anyone about her trip. Not long after, as he began to feel entirely out of his element, Mason tried once more to contact Savannah. The phone rang for a long time until, finally, he heard a quiet, "Hi, it's me." Savannah answered, but her voice was entirely different. She sounded distant, cold. "Savannah, where are you? I've checked every possible option. You didn't tell me you were going on such a trip, and there are strange things in your luggage. Can you explain what's going on?" She took a deep breath, and after a momentary pause, replied, "Mason, don't worry, everything's fine. It's just a lot of work. You know I don't like to bother you with it. Everything will be okay. I'll be back in a couple of days, and we'll talk. I'll explain everything, I promise." Her tone was calm, but Mason could feel the tension growing inside him, sensing that she wasn't telling the whole truth. Why was she so quick to dismiss the situation without explanation? Why did her words feel like she was hiding something much bigger? He couldn't force himself to end the conversation, even though he knew he wasn't getting the answers he needed. Everything she said only confirmed his suspicions. Nothing she said sounded plausible. He realized she hadn't provided any specifics or even tried to share anything concrete. This was only the first piece of the puzzle, and though he felt he was moving in the right direction, Mason knew he would face more disappointment before everything fell into place. So he decided to monitor every step closely, knowing that if this wasn't just a coincidence, he would have to uncover the truth. Mason couldn't leave these thoughts unanswered. The entire situation felt increasingly unnatural to him. Leaving his phone on the table, he glanced at the clock. Evening had come, but he couldn't stop his mind from circling around what had happened with Savannah. His intuition, though tired, kept signaling. Something was definitely wrong. The next morning, as he left the house, he couldn't find peace. He knew something crucial was missing and decided to sit at his computer. His hand instinctively reached for the search bar of Savannah's social media, even though he didn't want to do this. But something inside compelled him to keep digging. Instead of going directly to her profile, he simply searched her name. A sort of defense mechanism made him check there first, as everything seemed as though Savannah somehow sensed he was trying to uncover more. Looking at the first results, Mason stopped on her latest post. What immediately caught his eye was a photo from a restaurant. Savannah was seated at a table, beautifully smiling with a glass of wine in her hand, looking stunning. But in the reflection of the mirror on the wall, it was clear. There was a man sitting next to her. The man wasn't familiar to him, although he thought he'd seen him before. The man appeared wealthy and well-groomed, like a high-profile figure from the business world. Mason squinted, trying to make out more details, but the reflection was sharp and clear. This man couldn't be just a random stranger. Mason felt his heart tighten. Keeping his composure, Mason gathered his thoughts and decided to take another step. He logged into the airline's website to check the flight associated with the ticket he'd found in the suitcase. Entering the ticket details, he found the result. Savannah had indeed boarded a plane, but not to the city where she was supposed to be, but to another, more distant destination. And that wasn't all. The name of the person who had purchased the ticket was Clark Rayleigh. Mason couldn't believe his eyes. It was the same Clark Rayleigh who worked in the same industry as Savannah. He was a lawyer, and unlike ordinary acquaintances, his name echoed in all the news and business circles, even in major publications. Mason had never met the man in person but had heard plenty about him. Wealthy, successful, and exactly the type of man who could tempt someone like Savannah. He paused to think. What did this mean? Savannah had said she was traveling for work, but without saying a word about going with Clark. Why had she hidden this from him? Mason was sure this wasn't just a coincidence. Now he had all the evidence to start understanding what was happening. Mason decided to pay attention to another aspect of the situation. He conducted additional online searches and discovered that Clark Rayleigh frequently visited places where Savannah usually attended conferences and seminars. It turned out that they even had joint projects that she had never mentioned in their conversations. He felt betrayed. This was no longer just about a trip or work. It was something far more serious. Now Mason decided to find out where exactly Savannah and Clark had been during that week. After a few more hours of investigation, he learned that they had traveled together to a resort town known for its private and secluded atmosphere. The perfect place to keep an affair under wraps. He double-checked everything, and it confirmed his worst suspicions. Her business trip was nothing more than a week with Clark at a luxurious resort. Each new fact shocked Mason. Savannah had lied to him, and now he had everything he needed to uncover the truth. He felt disappointment and anger, but the more he learned, the clearer it became what had happened. This wasn't just infidelity, it was brazen and cold deceit. Mason didn't know what to do with all these facts, but he felt he couldn't let it go without consequences. He had to do something more than just uncover the truth. Now he was determined to find out what was really going on and, most importantly, what he was going to do about it. Mason wouldn't be the man he was if he didn't try to gather more evidence. He couldn't leave it to chance without confirming his suspicions. So, when he accidentally found out that Savannah and Clark Rayleigh would be at a restaurant in the city center, he didn't hesitate. This was a chance he couldn't pass up. The evening was pleasantly warm, with soft streetlight reflections glistening on the wet cobblestones. Mason stepped out of his car, feeling an unfamiliar firmness in his chest. He climbed the restaurant steps and, through the glass doors, saw Savannah sitting at a table, talking to someone. Clark. Like Mason, the man looked calm and confident. They sat close together, deeply engrossed in conversation, as if they had known each other for a long time. Close enough that Mason could feel it even from a distance. Mason froze in place, his heart beating faster. He pulled out his phone and took a few pictures from the doorway, trying to conceal his presence. He didn't want to make any sudden moves that might draw their attention immediately. This was a moment to collect final confirmation for himself. He was ready to keep his cool, even as everything around him felt like it was falling apart. After a few minutes, he summoned the courage and decisively walked inside. Approaching their table, he saw Savannah lift her head and flinch slightly upon seeing him. Clark, unfazed, didn't change his expression and calmly smiled, as if this were the most natural moment. "Oh, Mason, what are you doing here?" Savannah said. her voice unnaturally even, too controlled to be convincing. Her eyes couldn't hide the nervousness she felt upon seeing him there. She paused before adding, "This isn't what you think." Mason looked at her, his gaze focused and cold. "And what should I think, Save?" he replied, stepping closer. "You came to this city with him, and now you're having dinner together? Sorry, but this doesn't look like a business meeting." Clark smiled faintly, but it was more out of courtesy than genuine interest. He stood quickly and extended his hand toward Mason. "Mason, it's just business. We work together." His voice was neutral, his face showing no hint of emotion. "I think you have nothing to worry about." Mason clenched his fists, but said nothing. He simply looked at Clark, and then shifted his gaze to Savannah. "I'm not worried. I just want to understand why you're lying to me." His voice was calm, though inside he was boiling. "You always said you were on business trips, but this doesn't look like an ordinary work trip." Savannah nervously glanced down and then over to Clark, as if seeking support. Her words were already forming. "You're embarrassing me. I really can't understand why you can't just trust me." Savannah's voice was firm, but Mason could sense the subtle undertone of manipulation. Mason remained silent for a few seconds. He could have pressed her further, but he was more struck by how she was once again trying to shift the blame onto him. It was a classic tactic. He could feel her manipulations starting to work on him again. "I don't think this is embarrassing for you, Save," Mason replied, his voice softer but still firm. "I'm just trying to understand what's going on here. I respect you, but this looks very strange. Explain it to me." Savannah hesitated briefly before launching into an explanation. "This is a business meeting. You don't understand. I can't discuss all of this with you. You're not in the business world. You don't get how it works. Mason, I love you so much, but this shouldn't be happening." She spoke as if she were the victim of a situation Mason had created. The entire performance, the denial and justifications, was all part of her strategy to turn the situation to her advantage. Mason recognized this, but he also realized it wasn't the right moment to act impulsively. "I see," Mason said, quietly placing his phone on the table and showing her one of the photos he had taken that evening. "This is what I think. This is why I don't believe your words." Savannah froze. Her expression changed, and for a moment, she looked as though she had been caught red-handed. But she quickly regained her composure. "Mason, you can't treat me like this. I love you so much, but your suspicions hurt me. You don't know anything, and right now, you're just invading my privacy." Mason didn't know how to respond. Everything inside him screamed that this wasn't the truth, but she was no longer listening. Without saying another word, he left the restaurant. Back home, Mason sat in the living room, his hands clasped on his knees, his gaze fixed and intense. The room was quiet, interrupted only by the ticking of the wall clock. He waited for Savannah to return. He didn't need much time to come to a conclusion. Every step he had taken, every conversation with her replayed in his mind over and over. He had enough evidence to convince himself that his wife was being unfaithful, but all of it seemed to lose its weight when he looked into her eyes or listened to her words. When the door opened and Savannah walked into the room, her expression was as it always was, relaxed, carefree, as if nothing had happened. "Hi, Mason," she said, dropping her bag onto the couch and taking off her shoes. He looked at her, his gaze steady and unwavering. The time had come. "Hi, Save. Can we talk?" His voice was calm, but there was an underlying tension that couldn't be ignored. Savannah sat down on the couch, appearing relaxed, but there was something off in her eyes. "Mason, are you worrying over nothing again?" "You know it's not a big deal," she said, but her voice carried a slight nervous edge despite her efforts to sound calm. Mason silently picked up his phone and placed it in front of her. He pressed a button, displaying the photos from the restaurant and several other pieces of evidence. The plane ticket, information about her trip, even screenshots of her social media posts. "This is it, Save. This isn't what you told me. You said you were working, but you were actually on vacation with him." He pointed to a photo of Clark. "How do you explain this?" For a moment, Savannah froze, her expression turning confused. But she quickly pulled herself together, as she always did, trying to reclaim her confidence. "Mason, you don't understand. It's just business. It's not what you think. Are you trying to paint me as a cheater? You can't just take everything at face value the way you want to. Her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to speak with conviction. Mason didn't look away. It doesn't matter what you say, Save. I have the facts. I know you're lying to me, and I won't ignore this anymore. His voice was cold but steady. Savannah looked at him, her eyes full of confusion and even fear. She began nervously fidgeting with her hands. Mason, are you insane? Why can't you just trust me? This isn't true. You just don't understand how things work. Her voice grew louder, but Mason no longer believed her words. I understand everything, Save. I've seen it all. And all I want to know is why you've been hiding this from me. Why are you lying? Savannah glanced at him, her eyes full of regret, but it didn't matter anymore. She began speaking again, her words becoming more desperate, trying harder to deflect the responsibility from herself. I love you, Mason. You're the one ruining everything. You're always searching for something, and I can't live like this anymore. Maybe you're the one cheating? Maybe all of this is your fault, and you're just looking for a reason to blame me? Hearing her words, Mason felt his heart clench. This was gaslighting. She was trying to make him doubt himself, to shift the blame onto him, to make him feel guilty for not trusting her. But he wasn't giving in. He couldn't allow this to continue. Save, you can't keep manipulating me like this, he said, his voice quiet but resolute. I know what you're trying to do, and I'm not falling for it. Savannah went silent for a moment. Her gaze shifted, and she lowered her head, as if trying to escape the truth. Are you saying I lied to you? She asked quietly. Mason didn't respond. All the words, all the manipulations, they no longer mattered. He knew the truth, and that was enough. That night, Mason couldn't sleep. He replayed everything that had happened in his mind. It felt like he was lost in a maze of deception and manipulation. He wanted to understand why he had allowed all of this to happen, why he kept apologizing to her, even when everything pointed to betrayal. In the following days, Mason scheduled a session with a therapist. He wasn't sure it would help, but he could no longer remain in this state of uncertainty. He needed to talk to someone to understand what was happening to him and why he continued to believe his wife, even when all the evidence pointed to infidelity. During the session, the therapist listened attentively. Mason, what you're describing sounds like a classic case of gaslighting, the therapist said, glancing at their notes. Your wife uses manipulation to make you doubt yourself, to make you feel guilty for suspecting her. She convinces you that you're misinterpreting the situation. Mason listened, feeling a mix of anger and relief. He wasn't alone in his feelings after all. But why do I let her treat me this way? Mason asked, his voice softening. The therapist looked at him with understanding. It's not about you, Mason. It's about how manipulators operate. They make you doubt yourself, and you start to feel responsible for what's happening. But your wife uses this to avoid accountability. It was an important conversation for Mason. He finally understood why things had unfolded the way they did. His emotions were overwhelming, but at least now he had clarity. After therapy, Mason felt like a changed man. Everything he had learned began to fall into place. He no longer doubted himself. Savannah was manipulating him. Her lies, her gaslighting. All of it was clear now. He wasn't rushing to make any decisions, though. He wanted to observe, to see how she would behave, what new game she might play, and whether she could deceive him again. She told him her story, about why she had been with Clark and why everything had seemed so natural and innocent. She claimed it was strictly a business meeting, that they were simply discussing work matters. She insisted there was nothing personal about it. And while her story sounded convincing, Mason felt deep down that something wasn't right. Clark backed up her words, assuring Mason that it was just a work discussion and even thanking him for being understanding. But deep down, Mason felt that his wife and her new friend weren't telling the truth. He wasn't rushing to act, though. He decided to observe, to understand just how deep this lie went. Sometime later, Clark invited Mason and Savannah to his birthday party. It made sense for him to invite both of them, as they were colleagues and, supposedly, friends. Mason agreed, not expecting much, but he didn't decline. He also thought it would be a good opportunity to see how Savannah acted in a social setting when she didn't think anyone was watching. He was prepared for anything. The party began lightheartedly, with numerous guests and cheerful conversations. Mason felt slightly out of place among people he didn't know but tried to remain polite. He had a few glasses of wine to relax. However, he couldn't shake the feeling that his wife wasn't the person he thought she was. With each passing moment, it became harder to ignore how Savannah and Clark interacted. Their conversations seemed too intimate, too familiar for business partners. The way she looked at Clark was different. It wasn't the look of someone in a professional relationship. While Mason couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, the tension in the air was palpable. At one point, Mason felt the need to step away. He went to a guest room, feeling tired from the party. The evening was warm, and everything seemed serene. But in the middle of the night, he woke up. He needed to use the bathroom, so he quietly left the room, trying not to disturb anyone. There, under the dim light from the pool, he saw them, Savannah and Clark. She was laughing, and he was laughing back. Then they began moving closer to each other, and in that inevitable moment Mason couldn't ignore, their lips met in a kiss. It was exactly what he feared. It was undeniable proof of what he didn't want to believe. They both laughed, completely unaware of his presence, and a few seconds later, they jumped into the pool. Mason couldn't believe his eyes. This was the moment when he had no doubts left. He quickly took out his phone and recorded everything. Every movement, every moment. It was unbelievable, but he knew it was the only way to capture the truth. Mason couldn't stay at the party any longer. He couldn't continue watching this, couldn't bear to see his wife kissing Clark so casually, so openly. It was unbearable and, at the same time, extraordinarily painful. After filming the video, he quickly left, leaving Savannah and Clark at the house. He drove home, to the very house they had shared together. All the way home, thoughts swirled through his mind. The video on his phone was undeniable evidence he could no longer ignore. At home, he sat watching the video, trying to calm himself, but it was impossible. His heart was broken, and even when he closed his eyes, he could still see Savannah laughing, kissing Clark. By morning, as the sunlight began creeping through the windows, Mason still hadn't slept. He couldn't. He held his phone, trying to process the overwhelming emotions, but he couldn't. Savannah began calling him almost as soon as she woke up. Her voice on the other end of the line sounded innocent, as if nothing had happened, as if their nighttime rendezvous had meant nothing. "Mason, where are you? Why didn't you stay at Clark's? Why did you leave? You promised you'd stay." Her tone was surprised, even slightly concerned. Mason answered quietly, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I saw everything." The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, but he didn't back down. "I saw you and Clark. And I have it on video," he said, adding nothing further. There was a sharp intake of breath from Savannah. "What? How could you? It's not what you think. Mason, please listen to me. It's not like you imagine," she said, her voice losing its earlier lightness. He didn't listen to her excuses anymore. All her manipulations, all her attempts to convince him it was just an insignificant meeting, didn't matter anymore. She kept talking, trying to persuade him that it was all innocent. She even tried shifting the blame onto him, claiming that he had pushed her into a corner and she had been too scared to tell him the truth because he wouldn't understand. Mason felt his heart breaking, but this time he wasn't ready to give in to her manipulations. He knew he couldn't allow himself to remain under her control, that she was trying once again to manipulate his emotions. "I saw everything," he replied calmly, and without waiting any longer, he hung up. At that moment, as he heard the sharp sound of the call ending, Mason realized he couldn't live in this lie anymore. He knew he had to act. Now it was important not just to get answers to his questions, but to decide what to do about the situation. And though his heart was shattered, he felt that now his steps had to be deliberate. Mason began formulating a plan. Now he was ready to do what needed to be done. Mason felt the emptiness inside him grow as he made his decision. Sitting at his desk, he watched as the moon disappeared behind the clouds, the room filled with a silence that mirrored his internal state. It wasn't just a feeling of betrayal. It was a deep bitterness, a disappointment in what had become of his life. The decision he was making was painful, but at the same time, it was freeing. "She needs to feel what I feel," Mason thought, and a plan began to take shape in his mind. The decision he made resembled a strategic dismantling. He couldn't allow her to just walk away with everything and move on without consequences. Mason intended to make her understand the price of her betrayal, and for that, he planned to start with something that would truly hurt. He went through their bank accounts, assets, and everything they had built together. With the help of his legal advisor, he began the process of liquidating everything. The house, the cars, the collections they had amassed together. Everything was going. He had no regrets. He remembered how Savannah had treated him with disdain when he tried to talk about their relationship. And now, as all those assets began to disappear, he felt an incredible sense of relief. Once he had completed all the formalities, he decided it was time for a move that would truly leave a mark. Mason knew that social media had become his most powerful weapon. After years of presenting their perfect life, it was time to expose the truth. Among them were the shots of Savannah kissing Clark by the pool. Mason posted them on social media, accompanied by a story that revealed the full scope of what had happened. And he didn't just share the photos with comments. He wrote about how his wife had betrayed him, how she pretended everything was fine while secretly being with another man, and how he had been completely unaware. The post went viral almost immediately. People began commenting, sharing, and it quickly became a sensation. Savannah's friends and acquaintances started calling her, asking what had happened. Each comment was like a blade cutting her reputation to pieces. She lost the support of those around her, and her social status began to crumble. Those who once admired her perfect life now became skeptics. The morning after Mason's post, Savannah called him. Her voice sounded as brittle as thin ice cracking under immense pressure. "Mason, are you kidding me?" she asked, her anger barely concealed. "Do you really want to treat me like this? This is absurd." Mason didn't respond immediately. He listened to her, but he felt no pity. She had no excuses left. The more she spoke, the more he realized that everything she said was just an attempt to escape accountability. "Savannah, I just posted the truth. You don't want to see it, but it's there. You've lost everything. You can't do this to me," she exclaimed, her voice rising as Mason sensed her attempt to manipulate him again. "You don't want your parents to find out you threw me out onto the street, do you?" Mason chuckled, but it was a bitter laugh. "Your baggage is right where it belongs in the past," he said quietly, and he heard her outraged gasp on the other end of the line. That was the final blow. He hung up. A few hours later, he left her a small note on her pillow for when she returned home. "Your baggage is right where it belongs in the past." The words were like a cold stone sinking into a deep ocean. They weren't excessive or elaborate. They were perfectly aimed. Mason didn't want forgiveness. He wanted this memory to stay with her. He didn't yet know how he would move forward, but he already felt that his revenge had begun to unfold. Savannah had lost everything. Her friends, her reputation, her stability, and everything she once thought was hers. And while he hadn't yet made any final decisions, Mason knew his life was now filled not just with pain, but with a strength that wouldn't let him stop. After Mason left the note and closed this chapter of his life, Savannah couldn't let it go. She felt the control slipping away from her and couldn't bear not having the last word. Mason seemed broken and empty after their split, and that didn't bring her any peace. She still wanted to turn the situation in her favor, even if it seemed over to him. Failing to achieve her desired result from speaking to him directly, Savannah decided to act through social media. She knew it was her only weapon in this situation. And while Mason had cut off contact, it didn't stop her. She launched a full-scale campaign to clear her name. Savannah posted videos and stories claiming that all of Mason's accusations were slander, manipulations, and psychological warfare on his part. She appealed to her followers, asking them to support her. She tried to convince people of her honesty while portraying Mason as a manipulator trying to destroy her. Savannah worked tirelessly on her version of events. She messaged friends and acquaintances, asking them to share her videos and posts. Some began to doubt her story, but there were still those who stood by her, viewing Mason as someone who used others for his own goals. This sparked a real debate online, dividing people into two camps, those who supported Mason and those who supported Savannah. Mason was shocked when he saw Savannah trying to outmaneuver him online. He thought it was all behind him, but now he faced new challenges. His name became the subject of discussions, not just among his friends, but also strangers. He began receiving hateful messages and threats from people who had already formed their opinions without knowing the true circumstances. However, this psychological pressure only strengthened his resolve. He couldn't allow Savannah to manipulate others and play her game on her terms. Mason realized he needed to gather more evidence to set the record straight. He began compiling videos, text messages, and correspondence, everything that exposed her manipulations, to present the public with undeniable facts. Step by step, Mason shared these pieces of evidence on social media. He released a video showing how Savannah had fabricated her stories and manipulated the facts. It caused a massive stir online. People began sharing the video widely, commenting, and discussing it, drawing even more attention. Mason became a new hero on the platform, while Savannah's support dwindled. It seemed that she still believed she could maintain control of the situation. She rallied her old friends, asking them to write messages of support. But it no longer helped. All her efforts ultimately crumbled under the weight of the real evidence Mason had revealed. Within days, a wave of criticism engulfed her. People unearthed old photos and stories about her that made others question the perfect image she had tried so hard to create. Her reputation was in ruins. She lost the support of even those who had once admired her image as a successful woman. Her job, which once seemed stable, also began to waver as her management received numerous complaints and criticism about her behavior on social media. With each passing day, as the situation escalated, Mason gained more and more support. He became a true social media star, actively posting videos and comments that showcased his side of the story. He was always a step ahead because he had real evidence and facts, while Savannah was left with empty words. Mason sat in his apartment, scrolling through everything that had happened over the past few weeks. His heart pounded, and his mind raced. All the social media buzz, discussions, posts, videos, he could hardly believe he was caught up in such a situation. He had never intended to become a public figure, but Savannah's accusations and manipulations had forced him into this media chaos. When his phone lit up and he saw his father's name, his heart skipped a beat. He knew they would eventually find out the truth, but he hadn't expected it to happen so soon. "Hi, Mason," his father began. "We've seen the posts. What's going on with you?" Mason sighed heavily and replied, "It's complicated, Dad. Savannah's taken steps to make it look like I'm the bad guy. She started playing her game, and now everyone believes her." His father sounded deeply concerned on the other end of the line. "Are you serious? We've seen the videos, all the posts about you. This doesn't sound like the Mason we know." Mason sat quietly, listening as his parents tried to understand what was happening. He knew it was hard for them to believe all this. They knew him as a kind son, someone who always tried to avoid conflicts and was willing to compromise. "I don't know what happened to her," Mason continued, "but she's destroyed everything we had. And now she's trying to turn it all around by blaming me. This isn't just a divorce, it's something much bigger." His parents tried to find words of comfort, but it was clear they struggled to grasp what Mason was going through. They had raised him in a family grounded in principles and moral values, so they couldn't fathom how someone could be so deceitful. "You did the right thing, son," his father finally said. "You're not to blame for what happened. Your mom and I support you, but it's just very hard for us to process." Mason felt a weight lift from his chest. Though his parents were confused, they stood by him. They advised him not to take on more guilt and to let time reveal all the facts. "You're not alone, Mason," his mother added. "We're on your side, and if you need us, we'll come to you." Mason realized that even amidst all the chaos, this moment of support was crucial for him. It made him understand that this wasn't the end. And while Savannah was doing everything to turn the situation in her favor, he now knew he had not only the truth on his side, but also a family willing to fight for him. That phone call only strengthened Mason's resolve to stand his ground. He realized that from this moment on, he had to do everything to ensure he didn't come out of this as the loser. He needed to not only prove his innocence, but also show Savannah who truly controlled the situation. When his parents expressed their support, he decided it was time to bring this battle to an end. All the evidence he had gathered, the videos, posts, messages, would be presented to the public in a final series of revelations. He knew this step would secure his victory. A few days after posting the video evidence, Mason realized the situation had grown far beyond his own circle of acquaintances. Not only had he become a hero in the online space, but even the media started to take notice. He began receiving messages from various people, bloggers, journalists, even strangers who wanted to show their support. One of those messages was an invitation for an interview from a popular YouTuber who specialized in covering scandals and controversial topics. The YouTuber, whose channel had hundreds of thousands of subscribers, wrote to Mason, "Hi, Mason. I know what you're going through, and your story has become pretty well known among my followers. If you're interested, we could do an interview to break down this whole situation, share your side of the story, and maybe help people understand what's really happening. If you're interested, give me a call or write back." At first, Mason was surprised. It hadn't crossed his mind that this situation could evolve into a media spectacle. But given everything that had already happened, and realizing he needed to continue fighting for his reputation, he decided this might be his chance. He wasn't seeking fame, but he had an opportunity to share the truth and reveal the real story to the public. "Of course, I'm in. Let's set it up," Mason replied, his heart pounding with nerves. This was a new realm for him. He had never given an interview, never been in the spotlight, and it was hard for him to adjust to being a public figure. They arranged the meeting for the next day. Mason left his house, feeling a mix of emotions. He was scared, but he also knew this could be his chance. When he arrived at the studio, he was led to a calm interview room with comfortable chairs, a large screen, and all the technical setup for a live broadcast. Everyone around was working as if this were an important event, and Mason felt as though he was on a massive stage where every move could be noticed. The blogger, Artem, greeted him with a smile and briefly went over the interview format. Artem was a pleasant person who had worked with many well-known individuals and always tried to approach situations from different perspectives. He quickly gained Mason's trust and helped him relax. "Don't worry. I just want people to hear your side," Artem said as he took his seat at the console. And so, the interview began. Artem opened with a question. "Mason, you've become very well known because of your situation with Savannah. Many people support you, but some still believe her. How do you feel being at the center of this media storm?" Though nervous, Mason began answering, recounting his story, how he was initially shocked by Savannah's behavior, how her manipulations began to destroy his life, how he struggled but eventually decided to fight for the truth. Artem listened attentively before asking another question. "All these videos, all these posts on social media, can you tell us why you decided to share this evidence now? After all, many people say you were calm at first and tried to avoid conflict." Mason took a deep breath, understanding that this question wasn't just about clarifying the circumstances. It was a test of his motivations. He tried to be honest, explaining that his decision to go public with the evidence was because he could no longer tolerate the lies and manipulations. "I realized that my silence only helped people believe her deceit. If I stayed quiet, her version would become the truth," he said, looking directly into the camera. Artem nodded, pausing to give Mason time to gather his thoughts. He knew that in situations like this, it was important not only to get answers, but to help the person open up and show their true self. He then asked, "How do you feel seeing people discuss you on social media? Many support your side, but there are still those who defend Savannah. How do you handle the wave of negativity coming your way?" Mason relaxed, finding the right words. "It's difficult, but I can't let people manipulate my name. I'm not guilty, and even if some don't want to see the truth, I'll keep standing by it. It's my right." Artem listened closely and decided to add an element of intrigue to the interview. "Can you share with us any moments we haven't seen yet? Is there anything else you'd like to show the world to help clarify this situation?" Mason paused for a moment. He hadn't been prepared for this question but realized it could be his chance. He took out his phone and displayed the screen, where additional videos and messages from Savannah were saved, further proving her manipulations. He shared this material live during the interview, and it immediately went out in the broadcast. "This isn't all. Many people don't know how she tried to twist all the facts in her favor. Here's additional proof," he said, no longer afraid to hold anything back. The audience was stunned. The videos quickly gained traction, and the chat exploded with reactions. It was a moment that shifted the tone of the interview and brought Mason even more attention. Artem couldn't hide his excitement as he watched the audience's response. This has turned into a real show. People are asking questions, sharing information, and I see your truth reaching everyone, he said. After Mason finished the interview, he felt he had taken the right step. He watched as his videos gained views, and comments poured in from across the internet. The support was overwhelming, and even those who had doubted his version of events began to change their minds. All the evidence he revealed during the interview started gaining massive popularity. As Mason sat, reading through the comments and thinking about his next steps, a new notification flashed on his phone. It was a post from Savannah. She was reacting to the interview. If you want to see how one video can twist all the facts, then you should watch this. All the evidence he shows is just manipulation. I thought Mason would understand that living without conflict is better, but he chose this path. My truth is still ahead, and I'll prove who's really to blame for everything that's happened. The post was filled with anger, sarcasm, and resentment. She had no doubt she could turn the situation in her favor, even if it meant continuing to lie and manipulate people. But what she saw next sent her into a fury. Under Savannah's post, there were already comments from people who supported her, but the majority were questioning her credibility. All the evidence Mason had revealed during the interview began to cast doubt on her version of events. It was a blow she hadn't anticipated. Savannah grabbed her phone and rewatched the interview. She couldn't believe her eyes. Her entire world was beginning to crumble. She had prepared herself for some people trying to defend Mason, but not on this scale. All that evidence, the videos, the messages, the correspondence, was incredibly convincing. Mason had gathered facts that couldn't be refuted, and she knew she would now have to respond. Her mind raced. How could this have happened? How had this interview turned into such a catastrophe for her? She knew she had to act, and she had to act fast. But her anger only grew. Savannah picked up her phone and started typing a new post. It was like pouring all her rage onto the screen. She knew she couldn't just defend herself. She had to go on the offensive. She wrote, "Mason, you can't win this game. Your so-called evidence is worthless, and you're just a disguised victim of your own cruel manipulations. You think you can play this game without consequences, but you don't know me. I'll show everyone who's truly responsible for all of this. Defeat is all you'll get. Just wait. I'll surprise you all." She sent the post, but she knew it wasn't enough. Her plan had to be bigger. She was determined to stir up even more outrage among her supporters. She began to realize that the situation was spiraling out of control. She felt the urgency to act quickly and decisively, so she reached out to Clark. He was one of the few people who knew the whole truth about their relationship and could help her create a version of events that worked in her favor. "Clark, I know you're on my side," she wrote to him in a private message, trying to maintain her confidence. "I need you to help me in this fight. You understand that Mason is playing by his own rules, and now I have to fight back. Can you make a post and support me?" Clark didn't respond for a long time. Savannah waited, and her nerves only grew. Finally, he replied, "Savannah, I can't be part of this. Your actions lately have disappointed me. I see how you're manipulating people, how you're twisting all the facts and trying to make yourself the victim. It's all very immature. It's over between us. I can't support you in this lie." For Savannah, it was like a punch to the gut. She tried to convince Clark that he was wrong, but his decision was unwavering. Not only did Clark refuse to help her, but he also decided to make a post of his own to bring an end to the situation once and for all. "I can't stay silent," he wrote, "and I can't let this continue. I'm the person Savannah cheated on Mason with, and I can no longer be part of her manipulations. I no longer support her and am closing this chapter of my life. She's manipulating everyone again, and I can't stand by her side." The post quickly went viral, and people began actively commenting, dissecting every word he said. Mason, receiving such unexpected support from Clark, finally felt that the truth was coming to light on his side. What happened next, however, was a wave of backlash that hit not only Clark but also Savannah. Many people, surprised by Clark's honesty, began praising him. "He's brave to tell the truth. Good for him for standing up to manipulators." For Savannah, however, the situation was catastrophic. Those who had once supported her began expressing their outrage. Her own followers started questioning whether they should continue supporting someone who manipulated people so shamelessly. What Savannah had done not only cast doubt on her image and reputation, but also alienated the very people who had once believed in her. Through anger and despair, Savannah scrolled through the comments under Clark's post. This was the moment she realized she had lost everything. Her image as a strong and successful woman had been destroyed in an instant. She shut down her social media accounts, deleted all her posts defending herself, and fell into despair. She could no longer withstand the pressure. The situation became so dire that she decided to disappear from the public eye for years. She left the city and changed her name, trying to start a new life. For Clark, this was not a victory but a difficult decision he had made after witnessing everything that had transpired. He knew his post had unleashed a storm of backlash against him, but he still felt a sense of peace because he had done what he believed was right. The anger directed at him became a sort of test. He realized he was standing by his truth. He publicly apologized to Mason, admitting he should have been honest earlier. Mason, after all of this, came to understand just how far the situation had gone and how much it had changed his life. With all the interviews and public appearances, he could no longer return to his old life. He left his job, moved to a new city, and decided to start a new chapter as a blogger. Over the following years, Mason built a successful career, earning popularity for his openness, honesty, and ability to find engaging topics for his audience. A few years later, Mason met another woman who became his pillar of support in his new life. They got married, and he realized that everything he had gone through ultimately brought him to what truly mattered. A new chapter in his life began, and while the memories of Savannah remained, he finally found peace. What do you think? Is it possible to forgive someone who betrayed and manipulated you? Or is it better to hold them accountable for everything they did?